So in part of Anderson's stage model process, the last couple of stages are the policy impact, evaluation, and change. So our task is to take a look right now at the idea of policy impact. So Anderson defines policy impact as the effects or consequences of a policy, whether intended or unintended, on society. Now, that's a very important concept to understand because remember when we were talking about kind of the rational comprehensive theory, we made the determination that people could sit down and consciously evaluate what policies they wanted and to be able to chart what the consequences of those things would be and then make a decision based on the consequences, the entire package of policies that they would have. The fact of the matter is really it's sometimes in many cases very difficult to actually determine what the consequences of policies are going to be. So after the fact, we have to step back and evaluate what actually happened, whether the intended policy produced the results that we wanted or not. So there are a number of ways to study this, and it's a very complicated process, and certainly people from different ideologies have different ways to kind of accomplish this process to make the impact work in their ideological favor. The first thing to take a look at is how does the policy affect people that are directly involved or directly targeted in the specific policy. We call this the target population. So for this, let's use an example of a poverty program. If our goal basically is to give some kind of service to people who are in poverty to help get them out of poverty, whether that be some source of income or a source of food or something like that, our very first question is, did this actually help the people that we were looking to help and accomplish the goals? Did it give them a basic income level? Did it allow them to eat nutritious meals and help in that aspect? Now, some of the things that we can think about here, though, is that for policies, there can be intended or unintended consequences. So just a couple of things where we might see an unintended consequence. When we take a look at welfare programs, shifting income to poor people, does it actually help people? Or on the other hand, does it have the unintended consequence of, impacting people's willingness to seek employment? And that's one of the questions that we've grappled with over the years. And certainly, as we've seen from the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, Congress determined that there was a need to make a disincentive for people to be on welfare because they felt as though it encouraged people not to work. Think about public housing. The goal is to provide affordable shelter for people when market conditions don't provide enough affordable housing for poor people or working class people. Now, one of the things that we've seen is that, sure, it has provided shelter, but the way that we developed our public housing program, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, was we redeveloped whole areas of inner cities, and we tore down whatever was there, and then we built high-rise apartment complexes that were basically centralizing the poor in one specific area. Now, what that tended to do was, A, concentrate poor people in one area, and at the same time, segregate them from the rest of society. So the intended consequence was to provide shelter for people. The unintended consequence was we didn't integrate them into the community around them, and we segregated them. So that unintended consequence has been reflected in recent housing policy where we've tried not to build these concentrated public housing projects anymore, but have worked more to integrate people into the community. Now, other areas is that we may have policies that had an effect on people other than the target populations. And oftentimes this is kind of an unintended consequence. And, in public administration and in political science and even in economics, we talk about, spillover effects and externalities and third-party effects. We'll talk a lot more about this when we discuss environmental policy. But basically the idea that you have a public policy and it affects other people, not just the targeted population. So for example, some ways that we can take a look at negative effects. Think about the effects of interstate highways on cities. So our goal was to be able to move people around from one place to the other. to be able to move our troops around the country in times of the Cold War when this program was started in the 1950s. But think of the unintended consequences that this had on a number of things. First of all, think about the idea of what it did to cities. All of a sudden, the central city, which is a source of jobs, becomes easy to get to from outside of cities in the suburbs, so people can drive there. So people start to move out of the cities, and the only people that are left in cities are those people who can't afford to move. And this has a profound effect on cities. And it also creates kind of a suburban area where we segregate, modestly wealthy, middle class, upper class people as well. Think of the unintended consequences that the interstate highway system had on the environment. We're a nation of driving cars. And as a consequence of that, we've produced a lot of pollution through cars. This was not kind of an intended consequence of the interstate highway system. Another example of kind of negative consequences is we've had policies in the past of allowing people to clear cut forests, particularly in the national forests on government land. And there are a number of kind of externalities or spillover effects that this has on the environment. One is it affects watersheds. And we see much more flooding in watersheds. As a consequence of that, it hurts the ecosystem. In addition to that, as far as the ecosystem is concerned, clear-cutting forests rather than kind of a comprehensively very managed system of conservation has the effect of hurting kind of the ecological balance within forests. So, it's all about cutting trees down, but in the end, there are other effects that this has, like on our water system and on watersheds and various other things. Now, there can be some positive kind of spillover effects that we can talk about as well. So if you think about education, oftentimes we think when we talk about education that we're only really concerned with teaching those people that are, from kindergarten through age 18, and that it's really a source of acclimating them and teaching them what they need to learn to know to be useful. But also, we understand that the more money that we invest in education, the more it helps with economic growth. So that's a positive kind of spillover effect on the rest of society. And that's really why businesses are willing to spend more money on education, because they need an educated workforce, even though it doesn't directly influence them. If you think in terms of pollution control, it's got a positive effect on many things, but let's just say that we are trying to find alternative sources of energy. That raises the costs for industries that are very energy intensive, typically manufacturing. So while we're trying to help the environment by having cleaner energy, it also may have a spillover effect of costing industries that use a lot of electricity or use a lot of power, causing them more to make their products. So we have to think about that kind of corollary effect. But also thinks in terms of short versus long-term benefits or costs. And this is obviously very difficult for politicians to do because they're thinking primarily in terms of their own reelection. So there are some programs that I have listed here that we might think in terms of the long and short-term benefits. So Head Start is a program basically helping poor people to get educational training prior to getting into kindergarten. And the notion is that, particularly in suburban areas or wealthy areas, parents have the ability to be able to pay for these preschool programs, which acclimate with them with the skills that they need to have in order to be able to hit the ground running in kindergarten. So Head Start pays for these programs. And the idea is if we pay for these programs in advance, then we don't have as much problem dealing with kind of remedial education programs once we start up with the kindergarten and so forth. Think about public recreation centers. They are basically designed to keep people off of the streets, right? So, if you have people in the recreation centers, it means that they have something to do. And the idea is that if we fund these programs, we'll have less crime. Libraries. They're something that's often cut whenever there are budget cuts. But when you start to think about what purpose libraries serve in society, it's more than just checking out books. So if you ever go to a Philadelphia library, or really most libraries, I guess, in the hours of about 3 to 5 or 3 to 6 p.m. During the week, during the school year, what you'll find is that public libraries actually serve as a really kind of an after-school shelter program for many kids who have no place else to go. And this gives them a safe place to be able to do their homework and to wait around until the parents might get home from work. In addition, a lot of job training services are provided through Philadelphia library programs and other libraries as well. People that don't have access to high-speed internet go to the libraries and use these programs as a way to be able to search for jobs, to build their skills, and so forth. So you may only think of the library as being a place where books are kind of stored and housed, but in reality, they serve a lot of different purposes that help over the long term. And finally, the Affordable Care Act is another way to take a look at the long versus short-term consequences. And the idea here, again, is that, yeah, we pay a little bit more money up front to be able to give people access to consistent health care. But what that does is save money over the long term, because if we have preventative care, it means that we don't have to deal with these really emergency situations later on that cause a lot of kind of financial stress on the healthcare system. So let's get people regularly to the doctor. As a consequence of being regularly to the doctor, they will be on medications that might help them later down the line, prevent them from having serious healthcare problems later on, and also prevent the high costs. So that, again, is the long versus short-term benefits. Now, every policy that we have has costs, and we have to learn how to address what these costs are. So there are basically three things that we can think of: direct, indirect, and opportunity costs. So direct costs essentially is, how do we focus on who's going to pay for a program? And use the kind of example of pollution control here. So there are many ways that we can take a look at who would pay for pollution control. Should we pass this cost directly on to, say, for example, the coal-fired power plant? Are they completely responsible for retrofitting their coal-fired power plant to have less emissions? That would be a direct cost. Or does the federal government decide that they are going to have tax breaks or tax credits or somehow subsidize coal-fired power plants so that they don't pay all of the costs associated with this? Or do we just allow basically companies to pass that directly on to consumers? Who's going to pay for these programs and who ends up paying for them are a point of great contention in American politics. There can also be indirect costs associated with a policy program. So, for example, with the Affordable Care Act, there was a provision in the Affordable Care Act that said that any employee working over 30 hours a week would have to have access to health care through their employer. And this, in consequence, led to some people having their hours lowered below 30 hours a week in an effort to be able to prevent them from having to provide health care. And I can tell you that this was a big thing in higher education, because adjunct professors were kind of limited in the amount of courses that they could teach at specific universities because the universities didn't want to offer them health care. So indirect costs are things that you didn't expect to have happen, or you may have expected, but just allowed to happen anyway. And then finally, we have opportunity costs. So we can't afford to pay for everything all at once. There's a finite amount of budget that we have. We can't afford to be able to look into every problem at once. So opportunity costs are basically, if we deal with one issue now, how does that prevent us from dealing with other issues? If we spend money on something right now, how does that prevent us from dealing with other issues that society might want us to deal with? So we've got direct, indirect, and opportunity costs. And then finally, in looking at kind of these dimensions of policy impact, this is really kind of something Anderson talks about, a little iffy on how important this actually is, but there are kind of material or symbolic benefits that might be associated with the public policy. So a material benefit would essentially be, I get something out of that program. So there's a tax cut, and that has a material benefit on my wallet because I end up getting a net gain of $1,000 as a consequence of the tax cut. So something tangible that I have that I can take away from a public policy. Now, in many cases, there are also kind of symbolic consequences or effects of a public policy in which I don't get any tangible benefits, but there was some meaning behind that. And I'll give you an example of that. In 1957, we passed the first Civil Rights Act since right after the Civil War during the period of Reconstruction. This 1957 Civil Rights Act essentially did no tangible things to help out African Americans in the United States. But the very fact that after almost a century of not working on civil rights bills and having them being blocked by the U.S. Senate and by Southern senators, the very fact that we passed a Civil Rights Act in 1957 was a symbolic gesture that we finally, as a country, were going to be able to deal with problems related to this. And of course, some of the things that came out of the 57 Civil Rights Act led to more advantages in the mid-1960s. So those are the dimensions of the policy impact that we would be talking about.